Have you ever felt like something was about to go wrong, but you weren't sure what? As if the road itself was trying to tell you to turn back? That's exactly how I felt that sweltering afternoon, driving alone on Route 66, crossing the Arizona desert toward Los Angeles. The road seemed endless, miles and miles of cracked asphalt without a single oncoming car. Just me, my car, and a dry heat that made the steering wheel burn in my palm. The sun was beginning to dip behind the rock formations, tinting the sky with hues of orange, rust, and gold. It was beautiful but also strange, as if the desert itself were trying to distract me from something approaching. The absolute silence around me wasn't peace. It was an uncomfortable absence, as if the world had stopped just to see what I would do next. And maybe it had. The GPS was no longer working. Signal? None. Not even 3G. Not a single life bar. I was completely off the map. But the road was still there, insistent on continuing, as if it wanted to take me somewhere, it just wouldn't say where. From time to time I passed rusted, nearly illegible signs advertising gas stations that no longer existed, abandoned motels, broken windows, crumbling signs. Everything seemed forgotten by time, as if no one had dared stop there for years, and yet something in me persisted. Maybe the rush, maybe the loneliness, or maybe because when you drive alone for too long you start to ignore certain instincts that should be listened to. I remember exactly the moment the car shuddered. A sharp crack, like a bone breaking. A flat tire. Of course, in the middle of the desert. No signal. Not a single soul around. For a second, I laughed. It was so predictable it seemed part of a cheap script, but the laughter was short-lived. As I stepped out of the car, the heat hit me hard, like a punch to the chest. The wind was hot and carried with it a fine, almost imperceptible dust that clung to my skin like a warning. There was no shade, no shelter, no options. On one side, deserted. On the other, more deserted. And right ahead, something I almost ignored. A small, blinking, almost unlit sign on the side of the road. A motel. Old, isolated, but with lights on. Something about it called to me. Maybe it was the contrast between the place's decay and that still bright light. Maybe it was just desperation knocking on the door. But I walked toward it. Each step was accompanied by that absolute silence, broken only by the sound of the stones beneath my feet. And that's how it began. With a lonely road trip, a flat tire, and a motel lost in the Arizona desert that, to this day, I can't find on any map. A place that apparently shouldn't exist anymore. But it was there, waiting for me. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you and make you think twice before checking into any roadside motel. Because the person watching you isn't always on the outside. I walked into that ancient lobby with my shoulders tense and my heart beating a little faster than it should. The glass door closed behind me with a muffled click, and a faint smell of old dust and damp wood filled the air. There was no one at the counter, but the fluorescent light flickered in an almost hypnotic rhythm, as if the place had been frozen in time, or was feigning normality. In the corner, a fan turned slowly, pushing the heat back and forth. An ancient bell rested on the check-in counter, next to a yellowed registration notebook. "You stay here at your own risk," I thought, half-jokingly to myself, trying to soothe the strange feeling growing in my chest. I rang the bell once, and the sound echoed more than it should have, as if the building were too empty. Nobody showed up. But the key to room 12 was there, dangling by itself, as if it had been waiting for me. I took it hesitantly, the cold metal contrasting with the stifling heat of the room. I climbed the creaking stairs, each step echoing in a silence that made me even more aware that I was completely alone, or at least that's what I thought. By the way, let me take this moment to ask you something. Have you ever been through something like this? A situation where everything seemed normal, but deep down, you felt something was wrong? If this kind of thing resonates with you, let me know in the comments. I really do. I want to know what you've experienced, what you think about this kind of place, or even if you'd have the courage to do what I did that night. And if you're enjoying this story, if it somehow captivated you thus far, don't forget to leave a like. It may seem like just a click, but for those who create this kind of content, it makes all the difference. It helps the video reach more people who, like us, enjoy this dark atmosphere, these forgotten stories along American roads. And of course, if you want to continue following stories like this, subscribe to the channel right now, not only so you don't miss the next episode, but because your presence here keeps this project alive. Your participation is what turns this channel into a community, a place where stories like this gain traction, and that is all too rare these days. Now, back to room 12. The doorknob turned too easily, and that's when everything really started to change. The bedroom doorknob turned as if someone had just released it from within. That icy sensation ran down my entire arm, as if my body were trying to warn me that I was crossing an invisible line. I pushed slowly on the door, expecting to find something, anything, a noise, a voice, even a sign taped to the wall, but all I received was the muffled creak of the old wood giving way. Room 12 was a forgotten portrait of an era that seemed to have stopped in the 1970s. Thick fabric curtains completely blocked the view from the window. The carpet was stained in several spots, and the bed, though made, had a dip in the center as if someone always slept there, in the same place. A tube television rested on a rusty stand, and the ceiling fan spun so slowly it seemed to be fighting against time. The strangest thing was the smell. It wasn't mold or dirt. It was something sweet, almost imperceptible, but it made you feel subtly nauseous as if it didn't belong there. I left my backpack on the chair and went straight to the bathroom, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to make sure I was alone. The mirror was fogged up, even though no one had used it, and it was there, right in the bottom right corner, that I noticed a dark, almost invisible dot, a hole, tiny, but at the perfect angle for anyone on the other side of the wall to see absolutely everything. The butterflies in my stomach instantly swelled. This wasn't normal. This was a deliberate, planned intrusion. And suddenly, that room, that entire motel, no longer seemed just old and abandoned. It seemed active, watchful, as if the place were attentive. I returned to my room trying to remain calm, but the noises began before I even lay down. A scratching sound on the wall right in the direction of the next room, then a soft creak, like someone stepping on wood. I stood completely still, listening for every tiny noise. The sound of a light tap on the wall made me hold my breath. The sequence seemed intentional. 1, 2, 3 taps. Pause. 2 more. Someone was there, and they knew I was there too. There were no cars in the parking lot when I arrived. The reception area was empty. There were no guests in the guest book. And yet, the room next door looked inhabited. Or rather, it looked alive. I took a deep breath and got dressed again. I needed to see for myself. I opened my bedroom door slowly, trying not to make a sound, and looked at number 11. The door was ajar. That alone would have been enough to make anyone back away, but I was long past the point of retreat. I pushed the door open with my fingertips. It was dark. No lights were on. The smell was different. There was mold, dampness, and neglect here, but still, the bed was unmade, as if someone had just left, as if they had heard me approaching, as if they had waited for me, and given up at the last second. On the wall between the rooms there were marks, scrapes, scratches, even the outline of something that looked like it had been glued there for a long time. Maybe a painting, maybe a mirror, maybe something more functional, like a hidden panel. At that moment, I realized something that would stay with me for the rest of the night. Room 11 wasn't just next door to mine. It was an access point, a lookout post, a silent backstage to everything that was happening on the other side. It was there that the hidden truth of that place began to take shape. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because what began as a simple detour was about to turn into a journey into what we usually ignore when we're tired, sweaty, and desperate for rest. The real impact of the decisions we make when no one seems to be looking, except someone was, always was. Comment there. I felt that too. The first time I saw the sign, I thought it was a mirage. In the middle of the desert, with my head pounding with heat and the sky becoming a reddish blur above me, that intermittent sequence of light seemed almost delusional. Desert Star Motel. The letters blinked erratically, as if begging for attention, but at the same time carrying a kind of weariness, as if they'd seen too much. I stood for a few seconds on the side of the road, staring at that name, trying to remember if I'd seen it before on some map, some list of reliable stops along Route 66. Nothing. No memory. No record. Just this nagging feeling that this place shouldn't be there. Still, my feet kept moving forward. It's curious how in moments of tension we don't seek logic, we seek relief. And that's exactly what I felt. Relief. A place with light, with shadow, with walls, even if it was old, even if it was strange. Fatigue makes us vulnerable. And perhaps that's one of the quietest truths of the human journey. It's not fear that defeats us first. It's fatigue. And I was exhausted. The walk to reception was short, but full of details that seemed to tell me stories no one else had heard. The asphalt in the parking lot was cracked, as if time had passed more quickly there. Some old cars were covered in thin layers of dust, as if they had been forgotten in a hurry. But they weren't. Completely dilapidated. They were vehicles from the 2000s, perhaps even newer. This caused me a strange unease, because it gave the feeling that they had been abandoned, not long ago. The reception hall was lit by a single ceiling lamp, its yellowish light seemingly unable to fully reach the corners of the room. The walls were decorated with faded paintings, images of deserts, sunsets, and landscapes that should have been welcoming, but only reinforced the solitude of the space. There was no receptionist, and the clock on the wall was stopped. I stopped. I watched. I listened for any sound, only the distant hum of the neon sign outside. It was then that I noticed something that would stay with me throughout my stay there: the silence. Not the usual silence of empty spaces, but a charged silence. A silence that seemed layered, as if the entire building was waiting for me to say something, for me to make some kind of mistake, or maybe for me to stay. The ledger on the counter was open, and the last signature was dated 6 months ago. But the pen was uncapped, as if someone had just used it and simply walked away. This gave me pause. It was like seeing someone's footprints in the snow minutes after a storm had stopped. It told me two things. Someone had been there, and probably hadn't left. Even so, I signed my name. I can't even say why I did it. Maybe it was the desire to leave a trail, a mark, a record that I was there, in case they needed to look for me later. And, yes, that thought crossed my mind more quickly than I'd like to admit. The key to room 12 hung alone. It was the only one not covered in dust. The metal was clean, shiny. That alone would be a warning to any sane person. But at that moment, what caught my attention most was that everything seemed functional. An old, isolated, God-forsaken place, but functional. And that, ironic as it may sound, reassured me, temporarily. I climbed the outside steps, which creaked with each step as if to ask me if I was sure of what I was doing. I wasn't. But I continued. The bedroom door opened easily, without needing force. And inside, a new layer of that distorted reality revealed itself. The room looked like a hastily assembled theater. Everything was in place, but nothing felt right. The paintings hung slightly to the sides. The bed was made, but the bottom sheet had a subtle crease, as if someone had lain there recently. The window was locked from the inside, but the curtains swayed as if they had just been released. And again, that sweet, disguised scent slowly invading and settling in my lungs, as if the air were drugged, as if the room itself were trying to soften my perception of what was really happening there. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to understand why this place, even so seemingly normal, made me feel like I was being watched. There were no visible cameras, there were no one-way mirrors, but there was something, a weight in the air, a sense of surveillance, and it was more than paranoia. It was as if the motel had a consciousness, as if it were an organism unto itself, and I had been swallowed by it. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there are things you only realize when you allow yourself to see beyond the surface, when you stop seeking immediate relief and start seeing behind the scenes. And it was at that moment that I began to realize that the Desert Star Motel wasn't just a temporary shelter in the middle of nowhere. It was part of something much bigger. Something that until that moment I had never dared to imagine. Right there, I wouldn't trust those lights. The reception door was open, but there was no sound coming from inside. No voices, no footsteps, not even the rustle of paper in the wind. It was as if time had stopped there, or been forcibly removed. What disconcerted me wasn't just the absence of people, but the meticulous care with which everything was arranged, as if someone had left for a second and never returned. The lights were on. The small fan spun silently in the left corner of the ceiling, and the counter seemed far too clean for such an isolated place in the middle of the desert. Nothing there made sense, and yet everything was exactly where it should be. The brass bell above the counter stared at me like a silent invitation. I rang it once. The sound was deeper than I expected, resonating through the reception area like an ancient echo, all too familiar for a supposedly forgotten place. I waited. A minute. 2. Nothing. No shadows moving behind the half-open wooden door at the back. No noise from the hallways. No response. This was more than absence. It was as if the structure had been abandoned only physically, but the presence of something or someone still lingered there, rooted in the walls. I looked around for a camera, an intercom, any sign of remote control, but what I found was a logbook, open exactly halfway. The pages were yellowed, some glued together, and most of the names seemed faded with time, but there was one detail that froze me. The blank page was still slightly tilted, as if recently written. The uncapped black pen rested beside it, still damp at the tip, and there, a signature in cursive, just a first name, Rachel. No date, no time, just a name left behind like a clue or a farewell. I can't say what made me pick up the pen. Maybe it was the fear of being erased, of leaving no trace, or maybe it was an attempt to connect with that person, even without knowing who they were. I wrote my name slowly, as if to reassure myself that I still existed, and for a moment, as the ink dripped onto the paper, I felt like someone was reading each letter along with me. It was a strange, almost intimate sensation, as if I had become part of a secret list I could never remove. Behind the counter was a wooden shelf with numbered hooks. Most of the keys were gone. Only 3 still hung there, 3, 12, and 16. I grabbed the key for 12, without a second thought. It was the same key I'd noticed outside, clean, lonely, as if it had been waiting for me. The keychain was heavy, made of iron, with a star engraved in the center, the same symbol that flickered in neon outside. The Desert Star Motel had a stronger identity than any modern chain, but its soul seemed broken. I went back outside, and once again the dry heat hit me like a reminder that, here, everything was under an invisible layer of surveillance. It wasn't the usual kind of observation like cameras or sensors. It was something more primal, as if the walls were watching, as if the floor heard every footstep. It was a perception that came not from the eyes, but from the skin, the mind, the instinct. I slowly climbed the wooden steps that led to the upstairs bedrooms. The creak of each step seemed to echo louder than it should have, almost as if announcing my arrival. When I stopped in front of number 12, the wood of the door seemed to breathe. The latch was worn but functional. The lock turned with a soft click, and for a moment, I thought I heard a muffled sigh coming from inside. I ignored it, or tried to ignore it. It was too late to turn back. The room was immersed in a silence even deeper than that of the reception area. It was as if the air there were suspended in time still, heavy. The curtains completely blocked the late afternoon light, and the only illumination came from a dim, flickering corner lamp. The bed was made, but with a strange symmetry, as if it had been made by someone who didn't quite understand what a bed should look like, or worse, as if it had merely been staged. And that was when it hit me, the absence of a receptionist. The damp pen, the dust-free key. Nothing there was careless. Everything was intentional. Every detail seemed choreographed to make me feel safe, yet watched, like an actor unaware of their performance but still feeling the audience's eyes. The difference is that, in this case, I had no idea where the audience was, or if there was one. Perhaps the audience was the venue itself. I sat on the bed, breathless. I tried to convince myself it was just a run-down motel, just one night, just a cheap room on the side of a forgotten road. But my body knew better than I did, and in that moment, something inside me had already changed. A subtle but irreversible transformation, as if I'd crossed an invisible line, as if, by filling out that book and turning that doorknob, I'd agreed to enter a game much bigger than I'd imagined, and the hidden truth behind it all was still waiting for me, just beyond the next door. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there are things that aren't just in objects, sounds, or places, but in the silent impact that certain spaces have on our minds, our perceptions, our very idea of reality. The Desert Star Motel didn't welcome me by chance. It chose me. Comment there. There's something wrong with this place. The click of the lock echoed inside the room as if sealing a silent pact. I locked the door from the inside with automatic slowness, as if my body already knew this was more than a simple gesture of security. It was an ancestral reflex, the instinct for self-protection, to keep the unknown out. Only at that moment I still didn't understand. The danger might not be outside. The room was a paradox, old, yet incredibly clean. The curtains were thick and heavy, a deep red that blocked any trace of the evening light. Outside, the carpet, though worn, looked recently vacuumed. There was a sense of forced organization, as if someone had followed a manual on how to prepare a room for a human guest, only soulless, unlived, lacking the small imperfections that make a space real. The television was an old tube, the kind you don't see anywhere anymore, not even in pawn shops. But the detail that caught my attention was the remote control on top of the dresser, brand new, clear plastic, still with a protective sticker covering the buttons. It was as if they'd put it there just to convince me everything was normal. And no matter how hard I tried to cling to that idea, the whole room seemed to be playing a role I couldn't control. The bed was centered, with sheets stretched almost obsessively. The pillows seemed overinflated, symmetrical, as if they'd never been used. There was a side table with a small lamp, and on it, a notepad bearing the Motel logo. But no pen, no scribbles, no signs of use. Everything was too new in a place too old. I sat on the edge of the bed trying to understand why this bothered me so much. I'd stayed in cheap motels before, worse places, filthier rooms. But here, there was something deeper, something that didn't show itself directly, but manifested itself in the air, in the vibe of the room. It was as if the place were disguised, as if the filth, the abandonment, the failing structure had been masked, not to please the guest, but to deceive. I decided to close the curtains completely and turn on the dim lamplight. The room felt stuffy, as if sealed off, and that was when I heard the first noise. Nothing too loud, just a faint creak coming from the wall, as if something had shifted position on the other side. At first I thought it was plumbing, wood swelling, some sound typical of old structures. But then came another, and another, at spaced intervals, rhythmic, almost intentional. I stood up slowly, listening intently to locate the source. The mabr sounds were coming from the left wall, exactly where room 11 would be located. I remembered the empty logbook, the missing room 11 key on the shelf, the empty reception desk, and for the first time, the feeling of being watched stopped being paranoia and became logical. I approached the wall, cautiously placing my ear against it, and what I heard wasn't a random noise. It was breathing, faint, slow, rhythmic, almost like someone trying to remain completely silent but unable to control their own body. I instinctively recoiled, my stomach churning. That wasn't the sound of pipes or of structures, it was someone, on the other side. And if it was someone, they shouldn't have been there. I went to the door to check the lock again. It was intact, but the certainty that I was alone had completely vanished. From then on, every second inside that room would be different. It wasn't about where I was anymore. It was about who knew where I was. I then decided to explore every detail of the room, one by one. I searched the small table, the corners of the carpet, the back of the TV. Everything seemed ordinary, until I reached the bathroom mirror, large, square, with a simple frame. I approached, and again, something wasn't right. The mirror seemed darker. There was no direct light shining on it, and even with the lamp on, my reflection seemed duller, more distant, as if there were a film between me and the image. I tilted my face, trying to see the sides, and that's when I saw a small dark dot in the lower right corner, tiny but clear, a hole, perfectly drilled, at a perfect angle for anyone on the other side of the wall to observe me unseen. I backed away immediately, my heart racing. The kind of fear that isn't a scream, it's silence. The kind of fear that doesn't paralyze but leaves you hypervigilant. At that moment, my mind shifted into a mode I'd only experienced in extreme situations, a mix of adrenaline, rationality, and intuition. And the question, lingering, was simple. Why was this room of all the others ready? Why did it look brand new in a motel that was completely in ruins? And who else knew I was here? Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because certain places aren't just physical spaces. They're open doors to revelations that shake up our beliefs about safety, control, and even sanity. Room 12 wasn't just a random choice. It was part of something planned, part of a hidden surveillance system. And the more I tried to break through the surface, the more layers of truth I began to uncover. Comment there. I would lock this door twice. The lamplight flickered for a split second. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my heart pound. I was still standing in the middle of the room, staring at the mirror as if it were more than glass and reflection. After discovering the hole, I couldn't look at it the same way again. It wasn't just a mirror anymore. It was a passage, a thin line between me and a presence I couldn't identify but felt in every inch of my skin. I slowly returned to bed, not out of confidence but out of exhaustion. The body may try to rest, but the mind cannot. I stared at the walls, listening to the silence as if it were music, because sometimes that's what silence is, a soundtrack of tension. With each new minute in that room, a new layer of strangeness overlaid the previous one. It was like being trapped in a barely disguised normality. The air seemed denser, as if something invisible had filled the space since I'd entered. There was a weight, an oppression that didn't come from fatigue or heat. It was something else, as if the place were alive, not in the poetic sense, but functional, as if it had eyes, as if it had its own system of perception, a consciousness sleeping beneath the walls, and worse, as if it were now waking up. I got up to close the curtains completely, even though I knew they were already practically sealed. But as I approached, I noticed movement in the corner of the window. The curtain in the next room was swaying, not from the wind because there was no breeze there. The desert air was completely still. It was human movement. Someone there had just released the fabric, as if they'd been there behind the crack watching me, and had retreated the moment they realized I'd noticed. I stopped. I didn't move a muscle. I just stared. The next few seconds dragged by as if time had slowed. The curtain stopped moving, returning to its static position, but the damage was already done. I wasn't alone. That wasn't an assumption, nor an exaggeration. It was a fact. A presence manifested itself, silent, calculated, and it was only a few feet away from me, separated by a thin wall of wood and plaster. That's when my body entered a different state. It wasn't ordinary fear. It was a kind of hyper-awareness, as if every cell knew something was wrong, but still tried to remain functional. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my mind clear, but my mind was on a single thought: who's in the next room? Or rather, what's in there? I lay down, but my eyes remained open, not sleepy, not confident, just alert. The TV was still off, and for some reason I felt like turning it on was crossing a line, as if flipping that switch would trigger some reaction, draw attention to myself in a way I didn't want. I glanced at the landline phone on the wall, which also seemed out of place. It was clean, dust-free, as if recently installed. I picked up the receiver. No ringtone, no noise, just silence. Another piece of that scene that tried to imitate reality, but stumbled over the details. It was like a replica, almost perfect, and perhaps that almost was the scariest thing of all. I sat back down, and when I peeked through the tiny gap between the curtain and the wall, I noticed the lights in the next room were on. It was the only illuminated window besides my own. This made me realize something deeper. Someone had turned on that light after I'd entered, because when I arrived the entire hallway was dark, which meant that while I was busy with the mirror, the hole, the carpet, someone had quietly entered that room, or worse, was already there, waiting. It's at these times that the mind starts asking questions the body doesn't want to answer. Am I in an experiment? Am I being watched by an observation system? Or have I fallen into some societal blind spot, a space where the usual rules don't apply, and where people like me simply disappear? I tried to rationalize. Maybe another guest had arrived later. Maybe I hadn't noticed the commotion. But no, the parking lot was empty. The reception desk was abandoned. The guest book was dusty. And even if someone had arrived, why exactly the room next door? Why would only that one be clean, functional, and ready? The truth is, when details align so subtly, it's not coincidence, it's intention. And there, in that carefully crafted scene, I could no longer see innocence, only manipulation. Now I want to delve even deeper into this, because this experience was becoming more than just a bizarre stay. It was turning into a direct confrontation with what lies between the lines of our decisions. That choice made in desperation, checking into the Desert Star Motel, was proving to be a turning point, a shift in mindset, a silent transformation for someone who thought they were just passing through, but who perhaps had never truly been free to leave. Comment. There. I saw that detail too. The light in the next room stayed on for hours. I knew this because the illuminated rectangle drawn on the curtain, directly in front of my window, wouldn't go out. It was as if that lamp were the only active beacon in an ocean of dry darkness, and I, the only awake passenger. Time there didn't pass the way it did in ordinary places. It dragged, and the more I paid attention, the more I felt this delay was intentional, as if something were trying to keep me awake, conscious, alert, a kind of silent control, not physical, but mental. The wall clock read 11:57 p.m. when I heard the first sound coming from the partition. It was a sharp crack, like wood being pressed by weight. I immediately froze, my body tense, my gaze fixed on the wall. 3 minutes later, the second sound. Footsteps. An irregular but human rhythm. Someone was walking in the next room calmly, not like someone trying to hide, but like someone certain they don't need to. The thought that the motel was empty had haunted me all day. I saw no cars in the parking lot, no movement of guests, no noise coming from other rooms. Everything seemed deactivated, frozen in time. And yet, there it was, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, as if someone in worn boots were walking in a straight line across an old wooden floor. Then another noise, something being dragged across the floor, a hollow sound of something heavy being pulled in small jerks, as if it were stuck to something. I walked over to the wall and pressed my ear against it. The sound was clear now. I could hear breathing, not panting, but rhythmic, as if the person, or whatever it was completely in control. And then, the knocks. 3 short knocks, then silence. 2 more knocks. A pattern, as if someone wanted to communicate without words. At that moment, my mind shifted into a different mode of operation. It wasn't just fear. It was data processing, pattern analysis, risk assessment. I began observing everything around me with a new perspective, searching for inconsistencies, clues, any sign that might reveal what was really happening. The bed, the furniture, the mirror with the hole, the silent phone, the unblinking light. Everything seemed part of a set, as if I were inside a stage designed to watch me react. There were no visible cameras, but the surveillance was deeper. It was as if the environment itself was recording my reactions, as if my every decision was being recorded for a greater purpose. I slowly walked back to the curtain and tried to peer through the crack. The hallway was dark. No movement, no shadows crossed my field of vision, but the light from the next room still shone just as brightly, and the curtain there had moved again. A slight tremor, as if someone had stepped back at the very second my eyes searched it. That's when I realized it wasn't just being watched anymore. It was more than that. I was being studied, tested, as if I'd been placed there on purpose, as if the whole thing had been set up as part of a behavioral experiment. There was no logical explanation, but all the logic I had left told me this was no coincidence. The TV turned on by itself at 12:03 a.m. The sound, at minimum volume, transmitted only static, but the image, curiously, wasn't just noise. There was a blurry silhouette in the corner of the screen, for less than 2 seconds. Then everything went blank. The screen went black, the lamplight flickered, and the sound returned. Footsteps. Slower now. Heavier. The vibration came from the floor, up the walls, through the mattress, as if it wasn't just nearby anymore, as if it were getting closer to where I was. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum on a battlefield. I pressed my ear to the door. Nothing. No breathing. No footsteps. Emptiness. I looked through the peephole. Only darkness. But I could feel it. Something out there had approached, and it was still, waiting, as if it knew I'd noticed. It was at that moment that something inside me shifted, a silent transformation, as if the part of me that trusted what I saw had been replaced by another, that trusted what I felt. That night wasn't about a cheap room in a forgotten motel. It was about connecting with a part of the world that lives on the fringes of our reality, a space between layers, an invisible backdrop to what we call everyday life. And once you see it, truly, it's impossible to unsee it. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because some doors don't need to be opened to swallow us. They just need to be there. And sometimes whatever's on the other side has already entered without making a sound. Room 12 wasn't just a room. It was an emotional trap, a calculated simulation to test my limits. And whatever was in the next room was part of this construction from the beginning. Right there, this goes beyond reality. My hands were shaking, but not enough to stop me from turning the doorknob. The door to room 11 was ajar, as if it had been left there in a hurry, or as if it had been waiting. A silent, dangerous invitation. The latch was loose, the lock broken, hanging like a fragile tooth on the verge of falling out. I didn't need to force it. The door opened with a sharp creak, the kind of sound that carries memories in the air. That creaking wood seemed to have held, for too long, secrets that no longer wanted to be hidden. What I saw inside struck me with a quiet strangeness. No body, no figure, No monster waiting behind the door, but the emptiness itself was too much. The room was almost identical to mine, but without the clean, functional appearance. It had the same bed, the same mirror, the same furniture arrangement, only everything was covered in a thin layer of dust as if time had stopped there decades before. And in the center of the room, right in front of the bed, there was a rolled-up blanket on the floor, crumpled, used, almost human in its shape, as if someone had slept there, or as if it were still there, invisible to the eye but present enough to make the atmosphere vibrate at a different frequency. I took a step forward, and my boot sank into the carpet, stirring up a dust as light as memory. The smell was different, wetter, older, a scent reminiscent of basements, stored wood, and forgotten fabrics. There was something there that clung to my sense of smell, a reminder that this space wasn't neutral. There was history, there was presence. I approached the mirror, and this time, there was no hole. Or maybe it was so covered in dirt that I couldn't see it. I pressed my fingers against the glass, and it responded with an aggressive cold, as if it were still in contact with something on the other side. The glass seemed thicker, denser. My reflection was there, but there was a subtle distortion, as if the angle wasn't quite right, as if I were moving, but my image took a half-second longer to react. It paralyzed me. It was impossible to tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me, or if in fact there was something wrong with the structure of this place. I slowly looked around the room. The television was unplugged, the ceiling light broken. There was no noise, not even that electric hum that accompanies abandoned places. It was a deeper silence, almost liquid, a silence that seemed to seep through the walls and seep into the bones. I looked at the bed and walked over. The sheets were tangled, the pillow thrown on the floor, and on the headboard lightly scratched into the wood was the word stay, almost faded, written with something sharp, maybe a key, maybe a fingernail. I stared at it for an unfathomable amount of time. Why would someone write stay in a place like this? Was it a warning? A command? A request? My mind began to form a parallel narrative. What if room 11 wasn't empty? What if it were an extension of room 12? As if the two together formed an experiment, a stage for something much larger, a theater in two parts, one active, the other passive, one clean, the other real. Perhaps room 11 was the backstage, the place from which everything was controlled, a vantage point. And that's when I noticed, on the wall between the two rooms there was a panel, subtle, a slightly darker rectangle with marks around it, as if it had been opened and closed many times, like an access door, a vertical trapdoor, and at the bottom, parallel marks in the carpet. Someone or something had pushed furniture through it many times recently. I placed my hand against the wood. It was cold, as if it weren't part of the rest of the structure. I tried to pull. It didn't budge. I pushed lightly, and I felt a click, a dry crack that didn't echo. And in that moment I felt something had changed, as if I'd unlocked something, not just in the wall, but in myself as well. I took 2 steps back. I took a deep breath. The air seemed thinner. The entire room had become an organism, a living body, reacting to my movements, testing my reactions. And at the center of it all, a stranger who entered where I shouldn't have, who moved where I shouldn't have, who saw what I wasn't supposed to see. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because certain revelations don't come with noise nor with blood. They come with details, with choices, with subtle knocks on the wall in the wee hours of the morning. The hidden truth doesn't impose itself forcefully. It presents itself calmly, and once you accept looking, there's no turning back. Comment there. I would have opened this panel. I returned to room 12 as if stepping through a portal. It was the same space I'd settled into hours before, but now everything felt different. The air felt heavier, as if permeated by everything I'd touched in the next room. I couldn't stop looking around. The walls were the same faded beige. The carpet still muffled my footsteps, and the yellowish light from the lamp insisted on keeping the darkness alive. But something had changed. Maybe it was my perception. Maybe it was the room itself. I closed the door behind me with a little more force than necessary. I turned the key, engaged the lock, and held my breath for a few seconds, listening. The silence of the room seemed to follow me in sync, as if the place itself knew I'd discovered something I shouldn't have. It was a silence that didn't calm. It was dense, almost embarrassing. I went straight to the bathroom. There was no longer any room for doubt. If there was any hidden truth in that motel, it lay behind the details, and the mirror was chief among them. The dim overhead light flickered slightly, creating shifting shadows in the reflection. I approached cautiously, as if the glass itself might react, and then, there it was, almost imperceptible, but clear enough to set off a silent alarm within me, a small hole in the lower right corner. At first, it seemed like just a flaw in the frame, a dark bubble, a natural imperfection. But as I got closer, I realized its depth. It wasn't a blemish. It was an entry point, a tiny but strategically placed opening, like an inverted peephole. From the outside, you'd see nothing but an ordinary mirror, but from the other side, someone saw everything. Me. I tilted my face and tried to see what lay beyond the surface. Darkness. No light, no glow, no movement. Just a darkness that seemed to move of its own accord, as if it were alive. I tried to imagine how long that hole had been there, and more importantly, who was watching over it, since when, and why. I looked back at myself in the mirror, and in that instant, the strangeness intensified. I no longer saw myself the same way. My reflection seemed more distant, as if the mirror were thicker than usual, as if there were an invisible layer separating my image from my presence. And this sensation was familiar. It was the same one I'd felt in room 11. I slowly backed away and began to examine the bathroom more closely. I touched the wall around the mirror, looking for cracks, for signs that the panel could be removed. Nothing. Everything seemed solid. But the hole, it was real. The mirror had been designed or adapted to be a one-way view. I returned to the room, my thoughts already racing. Whatever was happening there was meticulous, calculated. I wasn't the first to occupy that room. That much was obvious. And most likely, I wasn't the first to be observed like that either. Which led me to another question. How many people had walked past without ever noticing? I sat up in bed, but my mind couldn't rest. I was too busy reconstructing every detail of my arrival. The flashing sign, the empty reception desk, the uncapped pen, the logbook with the name of someone who never showed up, the 12-inch key ready on the hook. Everything was ready. Everything was waiting for someone. And the most disturbing thing was the realization that perhaps none of it had been by chance. Perhaps I had been led there. I began to remember small events throughout the day. The flat tire. The GPS signal was dead. The lack of any other accommodations along the way. The almost non-existent road signs. It was as if a silent force had pushed me to that specific spot. Not violently, but intentionally. And the more I thought about it, the more that word in room 11 took on meaning. Stay. It wasn't just a sign. It was an instruction. I stood up and returned to the mirror. I observed the hole once more. I grabbed the bathroom towel and, without thinking twice, firmly covered the dark spot. It was a symbolic gesture, I knew that. It wasn't just about protecting my privacy. It was an act of resistance, of refusal, of trying to break the cycle. But part of me already understood that this went far beyond simple observation. This was control, a simulation of behavior perhaps, or something even deeper, a manipulation of perception. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a point in the journey where facts are no longer enough, where the reality around us begins to crack at the edges, revealing more subtle and dangerous layers. The hidden truth doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just watches and waits for you to look back. Comment there. I would also close that mirror. I lay down on the bed, but it wasn't sleep my body was seeking. It was escape, and not from external reality, but from the internal avalanche that was beginning to build. The images of room 11, the hole in the mirror, the heavy silence that seemed to watch my movements, all of this intertwined in my mind as if it were already part of a lucid dream about to become a nightmare. The towel continued to cover the hole in the mirror, but the discomfort persisted, as if it were merely a symptom of something much larger, deeper, even older. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on my breathing. Inhale, exhale, count to 4, hold, release, a control technique, but the air felt thicker, as if something other than the desert heat had invaded the room. The sense of presence grew clearer as the minutes passed, a presence that didn't present itself, but also made no effort to hide. It wasn't as if someone were there with me. It was as if the entire room were someone, a living being, an awareness that fed on my hesitation, my restlessness, my need to understand. The last time I looked at the clock, it was 2:49 a.m. After that, I can't tell if I fell asleep or simply disconnected from reality for a few minutes. I only know I was woken by a dry, artificial, and insistent sound, the click of the television turning on by itself, the kind of noise that, in a normal context, would go unnoticed. But there, in that setting where everything was a choice, every light, every absence, every detail, that sound had the weight of a scream. I opened my eyes with a start. The screen glowed a grayish blue with no channel, no menu, no sound, just the pulsing light of a device that shouldn't have been active. The first thing I did was reach for the remote. It was still exactly where I'd left it, untouched. This meant the TV had been turned on by another source. An automatic program, a hidden timer, or something so absurd my mind couldn't yet name it. I went to get up, but something in the corner of my eye made me freeze. A movement, quick and fluid, crossing the gap between the curtains. My heartbeat went into overdrive. My body froze. My gaze fixed on that opening, just a few inches wide. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a reflection. It was a silhouette. Human. It was there. And it had slowly passed behind the curtain as if spying on me from outside. As if certain that, in the next instant, I would react exactly as I would. I jumped up, went to the window, and yanked the curtain shut. The outside of the glass was covered in dust, but there was nothing there. No footsteps. No figure disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. Just emptiness. But not the kind of emptiness that soothes. It was the guy who provokes, who broods, who insinuates. I went back inside, my fists clenched, as if to protect me from something. I looked at the TV. The screen was still on, but now there was something else. A faint, static sound emerging. Not constant, but pulsing, like the beating of an electronic heart. I walked over. I touched the off button. The image disappeared. The light in the room seemed to breathe along with me, and for a moment, everything was calm. But that moment was short-lived, because it was at that exact moment that I noticed a detail I'd previously overlooked. The lamp, which stood beside the bed, was no longer facing where I'd left it. I remembered it clearly. I'd adjusted the light toward the wall, but now it was pointed at the bathroom mirror, directed like a spotlight, as if someone had adjusted it while I was away, or while I was sleeping. I returned to the bathroom with slow steps. My every move was studied, not by the room, not by the TV, not by the mirror, but by something greater, an intelligence working behind the scenes, transforming inanimate objects into clues, a kind of code, a game of perception. And within this game, I was no longer just a player. I was the experiment. The reflection in the mirror was different. My face seemed paler, more elongated. I tried to convince myself it was the angle, the light, the fatigue, but part of me knew this was more than fatigue. It was transformation. The mindset I had brought to this place, that of a passenger, an observer, a visitor, was slowly being replaced by another, that of someone who belonged there, who was being shaped by it, not physically, but psychologically, internally. I sat back on the edge of the bed and stared at the bedroom door. The lock was still secure, but my sense of security had completely vanished. And that's when a new question emerged, more dangerous than all the others. What if I can't get out? Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there are places that aren't just destinations. They're devices, created to provoke revelations, peel back layers, expose what's most hidden within us. The Desert Star Motel wasn't just observing my behavior. It was revealing me, reprogramming me, absorbing me. Right there. Waking up at 3:11 will never be the same again. I didn't think twice. The impulse came like an ancient command, straight from the most primal part of my mind. I jumped up, grabbed the key, shoved my feet into my still untied shoes, and turned the doorknob with an urgency my entire body felt. The door opened with a sharp click, as if resisting for a second, as if the room itself knew I was trying to leave and didn't approve. The hallway was dark, but the exit seemed close. All I had to do was get to the car, go down those few steps, walk through the creaking floorboards, ignore what my ears were telling me about footsteps that weren't mine, and just get out. That was it. Simple. Just get out. Just run. Just escape. The desert night was cold, a brutal contrast to the suffocating heat of the day. The air hit my face like small, dry knives, and each breath was raspy. But none of that mattered. The car was just a few feet away, the old rental sedan, parked crookedly as I'd left it. But as I approached, real panic began to set in. The tire was still flat. Of course, I'd known that. Only until then, it had been a common problem, a mechanical malfunction. Now, it was a sentence. A prison sentence. I looked around for any sign of another living soul in that damned space. No new cars, no movement, no lights other than the ones that had been there all along. The old sign blinking slowly, and the window of room 11 still lit. It was at that moment, in the middle of the silent parking lot, that I felt I was no longer alone. I turned my head instinctively. My eyes slowly rose from the line of the car to the floor above, and then froze. There, standing in the window of room 11, was someone watching me. Not a silhouette, not a shadow, a clear figure still motionless with their eyes fixed on me, as if that person had been there the whole time, from the moment I arrived, studying me, recording my every move. The yellowish light from the window didn't reveal the face clearly. It was as if the figure were simultaneously inside and outside the light, as if made of the shadows themselves. But there was something worse than seeing that person there, realizing they didn't react, they didn't move, they didn't hide, they didn't run. They just stared at me, as if they already knew I had nowhere to go. My body wanted to run, and it did, even though I knew the chances of reaching any help were slim, even with the desert ahead, the absolute darkness swallowing the road, even with the sound of my own footsteps sounding too loud. I ran, as if that would free me from something that was more trapped in my mind than in physical space. The road stretched on, endless, without a sign, without headlights, only the sound of the dry wind and the crunch of gravel under my feet. And yet, even as the distance grew with each step, I felt it. I could feel that figure's gaze still upon me, as if I carried within me, strapped to my back, the weight of something I hadn't fully understood but which was now a part of me. And it was at that precise point in my run, between despair and disbelief, that a new idea began to form, an idea more frightening than any face staring at a window. What if that figure wasn't there to stop me from leaving? What if it was waiting for me to flee? Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because sometimes escape isn't an act of liberation. It's precisely what completes the cycle. It's what closes the experiment. It's the exact moment when the observer registers the final variable. How do they react when they believe they're escaping? What if all of that, the flat tire, the overly clean room, the broken mirror, the TV at 311 room 11 with the door open, was simply the meticulously designed path to this moment? Comment here. I would also run without looking back. I'd run for too long without realizing it. My legs began to give out after the second kilometer, and my breath ripped from my throat in the dry desert air. But I didn't stop. There was no logic to what I was doing, only impulse. The kind of impulse that isn't driven by choice but by necessity, as if some part of me had understood something the rest of my body hadn't yet processed, that I needed to get out of there. Not the motel, but from all of it, from what lay behind, from what enveloped me without touching, that shaped reality and manipulated time. When I finally spotted the first gas station, the cold light of a sign blinking on a worn roof, I couldn't tell if I was awake or just dreaming of help. An elderly truck driver saw me before I could open my mouth. He gave me that look somewhere between shock and pity, sweaty, dirty, with wide eyes and jumbled words. I didn't look like a man crying for help. I looked like someone who'd seen something he shouldn't have. The police were called immediately. They took me to a rural hospital, saying I was in shock. They asked me where I'd spent the night, and I told them, of course. Desert Star Motel. It's just off Route 66 a few miles south. One of the officers seemed to frown as he heard. The other simply wrote it down, as if he were just marking a formality. I persisted. I mentioned the flat tire, room 12, the figure in the window, the empty reception area, and finally I mentioned the mirror, the hole, the light at 311. 2 days later, we went back there. It wasn't until I approached the scene in the patrol car that I felt the weight of what I was about to see. The open space in the middle of nowhere was still there, but the motel wasn't. Or rather, it was a different state, faded, silent, as if it had melted away over time. The structure was still standing, but the sign was toppled over, covered in dry weeds. The rooms? Boarded up. The windows were all shattered. The reception? Overrun with leaves, dust, and termites. The place was clearly abandoned, but not since yesterday, or since last week. What the officer said froze me inside. This place has been closed since 2011. There are reports of a partial fire, and then it was closed due to structural instability. It has never been used again. That's not possible, I said. I slept here. I was watched here. The light was on. The bed was made. The towel was clean. The key was hanging. The TV turned on by itself. He looked at me with the cautious calm of someone who's dealt with broken people. But the strangest thing wasn't his reaction. It was the absence of any trace. Room 12. Room 11. All sealed with wooden boards and rusty nails. No locks worked. No panels. No mirrors. If you came in here, it must have been somewhere else. This building has been in disrepair for over a decade. No one has slept here for years. This was just a shell. It hit me like a break from reality. What had I experienced then? Where had I been? How could a place that had swallowed me so completely, with smells, sounds, textures, and time, now be in such ruin? I asked to check the logbook. All I found was an old notebook, torn and covered in watermarks and mold. No pages with my name on them. No signature from Rachel. No signs of recent use. Just moldy pages and woodworms. I persisted with the officers. I wanted to see the bathroom mirror, but there was no mirror left. No frame in place, no sign of a hole. Just a cracked, dust-covered tile that stared back at me as if mocking what I believed to be true. It was at that moment that everything became too quiet. The kind of silence that arises not from the absence of sound, but from the absence of response. And within it, the most obvious question: if the place has been closed for 12 years, how did I get in? Who opened the room? Who turned on the light? Who walked on the other side of the curtain? Who watched me through the mirror? Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because sometimes the truth isn't in what we saw. It's in what's left after what we saw, in what remains of the experience when everything else disappears. And the impact of this is lasting, not only because it changes the way you see the world, but because it begins to inhabit your own reflection, your memory, your voice. The Desert Star Motel may never have been a physical place. Perhaps it was a backstage area for something else. A crack, a fold, a transition zone between the real and what lies beyond it. Comment there. Some places don't disappear, they just change layers. The police car slowly drove away down the dirt road as I stood there, in front of the shell of what remained of the Desert Star Motel. My boots sank lightly into the loose dust, the sound of the engine growing more distant, then fading away. I didn't want to go back with them. I said I needed a few more minutes, but the truth is I didn't know if I was waiting to understand or forget. I only knew that in that moment, amidst the ruins and the absolute silence of the desert, something inside me was different, as if a door had been opened, not in that motel but within my consciousness. I stared at the building, the broken windows, the faded paint, the partially collapsed roof. No trace of the soft light I'd seen in the early morning. No keys hanging. No heavy curtains blocking views. Just ruin. But it was impossible to ignore what I'd experienced there. Every sound, every knock on the wall, every breath felt but not heard. It was too real to be made up, but too invisible to be proven. And then, as I stared at that dead structure, I noticed a detail. One of those things you only see when you stop looking. There was a mark on the ground, almost faded, but still there. The mark of my own footsteps from the night I ran, on the exact path I took from room 12 to the car, and then to the road, as if the place had left a trace, a single trail, a reminder that this really happened, but only to me. The sun was beginning to rise behind the distant rock formations, painting the sky with shades of gray and copper. The light touched the motel's broken facade and made the place seem alive again for a second. Only now I understood. The Desert Star was no ordinary place. It wasn't a roadside rest stop. It was a transition, a liminal space between what can be seen and what can be felt, a fragment of some hidden truth, the kind that emerges only when logic lets its guard down. Perhaps, I thought, there are other desert stars out there, other buildings that still carry within their walls something that escapes time and concrete, places where the rules of the world don't work the same way, where the past, the present, and what's left on the margins intertwine, where decisions aren't just choices, they're portals, where you enter whole and leave different, even if your body remains the same. I walked slowly back to the rescue vehicle that had left me there. I got in and closed the door carefully, as if the sound might wake something still listening. I started the engine. The engine responded with a dull roar, but before I put it in gear, I glanced once more in the rearview mirror, and I swear, for less than a second, I saw light in room 12. Faint, like the last spark of a match before it goes out. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there are encounters that don't need words to mark the soul. There are places that cling to their history, even when they leave no physical record. And there are truths that don't appear to be proven, they appear to be felt. And these are the ones that never go away. So if you're ever driving down Route 66 at night, and you see a motel with its lights on in the middle of nowhere, with an old blinking sign and not a soul in sight, you might want to keep driving. Comment there. I would have made the same choice. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story resonated with you. Maybe it was the strange silence between the walls, the feeling of being watched, or simply that doubt we carry after experiencing something no one else has seen. Whatever it was, that's exactly what drives this channel. These stories that touch the invisible and leave marks where no one else sees. So, if this kind of experience captivates you, provokes you, or makes you rethink what's so real, consider subscribing here. There's much more to come. Stories, encounters, forgotten places, truths that don't fit on maps. And if at any point you felt this story was written as if it were for you, leave a comment below. I'm with you until the end. It's the simplest way for me to know there's someone on the other side, feeling all of this with me. Oh, and if this video has kept you here this far, please leave a like. It helps this content continue to exist, to reach more people who also travel these roads long, silent, and layered. And when you're ready, the next video awaits you with a new story. Perhaps darker, perhaps more revealing, but certainly coming from a place where neither light nor logic can explain everything. See you there.